So the FIFA World Cup is an amazing event. But hands up whoever cares about this. Don't lie. I know some people could not care less. Because people from around the world come together, in this case, spread over 3 countries, and we celebrate. Now, if you don't really care about FIFA, and that's okay, you might just think they're playing soccer. And yes, they do play soccer, even if they do call it football. But FIFA is also a celebration of our shared humanity. FIFA demonstrates human traits we all share, including our spirit of competition, our sense of deep pride in wherever it is we come from, and above all, our understanding we need everybody in the game. The World Cup would be pretty boring if there was only one team from one country. Sadly, of course, FIFA is also exposing other human characteristics that are also very common: fear and hatred of foreigners, or let's be honest, racism. We have seen all of these human dynamics played out before the opening whistle of the first match, because the first task for any foreign athlete is to simply get into the country where they need to play. Oh. In Mexico, foreign athletes were greeted with joyful people, mariachi bands, enthusiasm, and a real sense of fun. Here in Canada, foreign athletes were greeted by many people in a spirit of anticipation, friendliness, welcome. Mexico and Canada, for some reason, had this weird idea that we should welcome the world to our country, which I assume is why we wanted to host the World Cup in the first place. Meanwhile, in the United States, many foreign athletes, particularly if they're brown-skinned or Muslim, were received with suspicion, apprehension, distrust. Many foreign athletes endured lengthy and pointless interrogations. Many were turned away at the border completely. The United States seems to want to prevent the world from coming to their country, which makes me wonder why they agreed to host the World Cup in the first place. But I don't want to dwell on that. But as I said, FIFA has brought out our common humanity, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. FIFA is not creating this dynamic, of course. It is just revealing who we are as a society. What do we do when a stranger arrives at our border? Do we treat them as a threat, or do we treat them as a blessing? And forget the States, we can see this in our own lives, actually. When we meet a stranger on the street, how often is our first response fear? And how often is our first response a little reminder that says a stranger is just a friend you have not met yet? This question is ultimately what is driving the theme of my continuing education this year, because I want to understand fear and hatred better. I mean, why is fear of strangers so popular? Why is it so easy to whip people into a state of continuous fear using propaganda that projects hatred onto certain groups of people? So, the short version of my thesis is all forms of racism and discrimination are stupid. So, why is racism still so common in our society? Now, I do understand the basics already, and I get 2 weeks more to study this. I believe the simplest, most simple statement is that hatred comes from fear predominantly. But even so, why are we triggered into fear of other people? Now, there are a number of factors, of course, but part of the problem was baked into Christianity. And on the one hand, that's unfortunate. But on the plus side, that aspect of the problem I at least feel well qualified to discuss, because I know one or two things about Christianity. And I'd love to hear your own ideas over coffee time or any time. But traditional Christianity has accepted and inherited from Judaism the concept of ethical dualism. And what's that fancy word? Well, ethical dualism, this is a Wikipedia quote, nothing religious here. Ethical dualism refers to the practice of imputing evil entirely and exclusively to a specific group of people, while disregarding or denying one's own capacity to commit evil. The consequence of this is the creation of us versus them mentality, thereby polarizing social configurations into extremes in a way that mutual understanding between the two poles is made very difficult or even impossible because the other is demonized. Ethical dualism was baked into Christianity from its earliest days, with the idea that good and evil are separate and distinct. Ethical dualism is reinforced with concept pairs like good and evil, heaven and hell, God and the devil, holy and profane. And here's the thing, once you've convinced people that good and evil are separate, it's a pretty small step from there to get them to believe that, well, actually, this applies to people, and some people are good people, and some people are bad people. And from that step, it is a minuscule step to getting people to believe that, of course, we are the good ones, right? Obviously, and they are the bad ones. In the Bible, this is expressed in the idea that some people are God's chosen people, which is pure racism wrapped in religious language. But I'm always surprised when I think about it to realize ethical dualism was baked into Christianity because I think Jesus did not agree with that. Christianity theoretically follows the teachings of Jesus. So both of the biblical stories I picked, and Jen pointed out that I keep using the same gospel, and I promised her I think I have a different point this week. You can tell me later. But Jesus did not support ethical dualism. So I want to look at those two stories. Starting with the story from John 8. So here's a summary. One day, Jesus was talking with some people, and some religious leaders brought to Jesus a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. The leaders reminded Jesus that according to Jewish tradition, the woman should be stoned to death. For example, from Deuteronomy 22, quote, "If a man is caught lying with the wife of another man, both of them should be stoned to death. So you shall purge evil from your midst." End quote. The religious leaders asked Jesus what to do with the woman. The religious leaders did not care about the woman. They wanted Jesus to give an answer that would split his followers into different camps. But to be blunt, Jesus had to choose between refusing to follow a religious rule and killing a woman. And so Jesus answered, "Let the person who throws the first stone at the woman be someone who has never broken any laws themselves." And the crowd quietly dispersed, and the woman went home. And that phrase from the Bible, so shall you purge evil from your midst, is classical ethical dualism. But Jesus rejected the punishment and the thinking behind it, because all people carry good and evil within. So evil cannot be banished through murder or expulsion or war or genocide or building walls to keep evil out, because every person has capacity for good and evil. Ethical dualism is simplistic and does not lead to truth. It instead leads to entitlement, exceptionalism, and racism. The local people were tempted to pick up stones to throw at the woman, but Jesus reminded them they are all a mix of good and evil themselves. The people put down their stones and walked away. And I suppose the question for today is, are there people that we ourselves are tempted to throw stones at, metaphorically even? Are there groups of people that we like to dump all the blame on, while we ourselves fail to see the evil that we contribute to ourselves? Now let's talk about Matthew 25, arguably a much more fun story. Often called the story of the sheep and the goats. Here's a summary. Because the story actually begins like an affirmation of ethical dualism. Jesus separates people into two groups, the sheep and the goats, and one group is destined for heaven and the other is destined to hell. It sounds like support for ethical dualism. But then Jesus pulls a fast one, because the distinction between the sheep and the goats is not based on ethnicity or religion or money or power. The distinction between the sheep and the goats is not based on what group you belong to. The distinction between the sheep and the goats is based solely on how you treat other people. What makes a person a sheep destined for heaven is, to quote Jesus, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was isolated and you visited me. And then to drive the point home, Jesus says that whenever you did those things for the most disadvantaged people, you did it to Jesus himself. So that is the opposite of ethical dualism. Ethical dualism says what separates good people from bad people is their membership in a particular group. But Jesus says what separates good people and bad people is their behavior, individual behavior. Moreover, Jesus says that whether or not we ourselves are good or bad is determined in part by how we treat strangers, like foreign athletes, for example. Strangers are not threats. Strangers are opportunities for us to decide, am I a sheep or am I a goat? And the answer will depend exclusively on our behavior. The question of how we treat strangers is very pressing, not only because the world is coming to Canada to participate in the World Cup, but also because anti-immigrant sentiments are on the rise in the West and even in Canada. Now, I won't cover the whole thing now, but some people argue Canada is a Christian country and we need to minimize immigration into Canada to preserve our Christian values. And the logic is, if Christians became a minority, then we will have our Christian values taken away from us. And I find that logic not very logical. Now, I understand the fear that comes when people in a majority group feel over time they become a minority group. I get that part. But Christian values include welcoming strangers. If you recall, we want to be the sheep, right? And this, not the goats. Christian values call us to welcome the stranger, the foreign athlete, the immigrant, the refugee. And here's the point. If we refuse to welcome the stranger, our Christian values are not being taken from us. If we refuse to welcome the stranger, we are throwing away our Christian values ourselves. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was isolated and you visited me. Christian values are not about our membership in a club. Christian values are actually about our behavior. And Christian values demand we welcome the stranger. So today is the weekend. We also celebrate World Refugee Day, which was yesterday. And what about refugees? The World Cup will end. Athletes will go home. But the refugees of this world do not have a home to go back to. They are not visiting Canada for a few weeks to play football. They're fleeing war, persecution, famine, catastrophic effects from climate change. They are on a much more desperate journey than any athlete. And they are arriving at our border every day. And Matthew 25 is very clear about what Jesus thinks we should do. Jesus did not say, I was a stranger and you checked my papers. Jesus did not say, I was a stranger and you questioned my motives. Jesus did not say, I was a stranger and you turned me away because you were afraid. Jesus said, I was a stranger, you took me in. Refugees should not be seen as a threat to Christian values. Refugees are, in fact, a test of those values. So let's go back to where we started. What do we do when a stranger arrives? One answer is fear, suspicion, stones. The other answer is mariachi bands, welcome, friendship. Today we'll be celebrating communion, and I created a communion liturgy just for this occasion. And as part of that, I want to leave you with a visual image, which you can enjoy over the summer, even though I'll be back in 2 weeks. So this is a stone. Well, actually, it's a piece of the Berlin Wall that the Lucas family gave me as a gift. And this piece, to me, is a sign of hope because the wall is gone. But I want to switch the metaphor right away and say this is a stone that could be used to hurt somebody. It could be thrown. it could hurt. And I encourage us to imagine putting down those stones that can cause harm and to pick up bread. Bread to share, bread to share with the world. We are called to be a mariachi band type of people. We are called to see every stranger not as a threat, but as a blessing at the border. God's own self arriving in a form we almost turned away. Put down your stones, pick up bread to share with the world. Amen.